My sisters sometimes cope with problems, and they perceive me as a problem sometimes, through humor. And so their latest is that maybe I never knew it before my mom died, but she had confided in them that she was pretty sure that Kathy's been working for the CIA all these years. So the joke around my crowd in Chicago is that if Kathy ever reaches her demise, somebody has to beat her sisters to Wikipedia to make sure that my sisters don't post that I was working for the CIA. But there is a certain oddness that I think we can prize, sort of stepping large steps outside the comfort zone and occupying the margins in the society that we live in today, where war and violence are considered to be so tragically normative. So I've been fortunate to rub shoulders with some of the most thoughtful and kindly people in the world, quite a few of whom are in this room tonight. And I've also, along with Steve Clemens, been able of late to get to know the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, and I'm happy to be able to tell you a little bit more about them tonight. But maybe I could start with a story that would certainly help introduce a little bit of what I'm like, I suppose, but it mainly says something about the people that I've been fortunate to meet in the Middle East in general, and certainly now in Central Asia. It's a bit funny to me to hear, oh, Kathy Kelly led 27 delegations over to Iraq, because I could guarantee that the best advice I could give anybody is never follow me anywhere. I can just about do right and left, up and down, and that's it. The one thing my family all agreed on, like instant consensus, we're not teaching her how to drive, are we? And they never did, and I never learned how, and I just am not full of common sense when it comes to directions. So, but this was really a very big absence in common sense on my part. I guess it was in 2009, one of our Voices co-coordinators, Josh Brolier, in his late 20s, and I were in Lahore in Pakistan, and we were so fascinated by what we were hearing from university students that we kept talking and staying into the night. While it was getting close to midnight, when we stepped outside, we realized that the cab drivers in Lahore had just about wrapped it up for the night, and there was no cab to be found. And we were way across on the other side of the city, on the outskirts, staying at the Garrison Lloyd School for Boys. And the students we were with were pretty concerned, and we said, well, we can take a rickshaw. And I said, I've got my cell phone. We can call ahead if we get lost. Hadn't checked to see if there was any juice in the cell phone. We got entirely, totally, 100% lost. It was 120 degrees that night in a steaming hot Lahore neighborhood. There was no pavement on the streets, and there's also nothing like a traffic pattern or a lane or a stop sign, and so the driver is just kind of playing chicken, trying to navigate his way through crowded streets, even though it was getting close to midnight. We're completely lost, and finally he spotted a sign that said Garrison School for Boys, which is the address that I did have, and I knew it was the wrong place. There were 3 campuses, and this was the wrong one, but the rickshaw driver was so excited to unload himself and unburden himself of his passengers that our bags were out on the sidewalk, and he had clanged a knocker on the courtyard door, and next thing we knew, we were inside a courtyard, and in those hot temperatures and with very sporadic electricity, people sleep in their courtyards. And so we had awakened a family from a deep sleep, and the father of the family looks at these 2 strangers. We speak not a word of his language, Urdu, and he just sized us up and went over to where his 2 children were sound asleep on a cot. And he gently picked each one up, laid them down on the same cot that he shared with his spouse, and then he went out one door, and his wife disappeared out another. He came back with a power strip and a fan so that there could be a light breeze on his 2 guests, and his wife came out with a glass of tea for each of us. He didn't know us from Adam's house cat. We sat on the cot. That was my timepiece. Oh, thank you, John. Thanks so much. We sat on the cot and sort of just stared thankfully at them. And this actually has been emblematic of the kind of hospitality I'm so familiar with. But I realize that there's a reason why in 2011 I've been thinking about that story so much. And it certainly has to do with the idea of courtyards and people sleeping in courtyards. And I think it particularly for me relates to a story from March 7th that I read about in the New York Times in a district called Surkhrad district in Jalalabad in Afghanistan. And it's on the other side of the border, the Durand line, but in that part of the world when it's hot, whether you're in Afghanistan or Pakistan, people sleep in their courtyards. And it happened that Joint Special Operation Commandos, led by soldiers from the United States, had been assigned to go on a night raid. And so this meant that at 1:30 in the morning, they had surrounded the courtyard of a family whom they were told was housing somebody from the Taliban. And so the first step was to pick up a live grenade, throw it into the courtyard. The 12-year-old Nilofer, the daughter of the man who owned the home, was sleeping on her cot, and the grenade instantly killed her. It landed right next to her head. And with the explosion, a man ran out, and he was carrying a gun. And so immediately, the U.S. forces opened up fire on the man carrying the gun, and he was instantly killed. And then the word came out that, in fact, the man who had run out carrying the gun was part of the Afghan local police in Jalalabad, and he was being trained to go out and patrol other villages. And it happened that his colleagues had said, no, you don't really know the locale that we're going to tonight. You stay behind. So he had bunked in with his brother and perhaps ran out carrying a gun because he thought they were being attacked by the Taliban. And so the bereaved brother was told by the U.S. soldiers, we're sorry, we're so very sorry. And he asked the New York Times reporter, what can sorry mean? I've lost my daughter and my brother. Well, there's much to apologize for in regard to the night raids that have become the tactics of choice in what I would argue is a war of choice that's now been waged by the United States against the almost poorest country in the world. It's second only to sub-Saharan Niger in its terrible poverty. It's the worst country in the world into which a child can be born because of the poverty. It's the worst country in the world, according to the UN, in which a mother can give birth because of the high rates of maternal death in childbirth. This country where 1 out of every 4 children doesn't live beyond the age of 5, where the average life expectancy is 42.2 years for women, 42.6 for men, where 850 children die every single day. This is the country where we're spending $2 billion a week, $10 billion a month, $1 million per soldier per year on a war which it seems fails so badly that the only way we could begin to say, well, maybe we can redeem some of the failure is to stay another 10 years, another $1 trillion or more. And 50% of the time, according to the highest officials in the Joint Special Operations Command, this is a September 3rd Washington Post report, 50% of the time in the night raids, they get the wrong person. Either taking that person hogtied off to be detained, sometimes held in detention for so long that over a 9-month span, 2,000 Afghan representatives of villages and families went to the NATO and the International Security Assistance Force troops and said, do you know where our loved one is? Where are they being held? The United States is now building a 3rd prison close to Bagram. They call it the Bagram Theater of Internment Facility. And just now we've discovered they're building a brand new prison after having constructed 2 prisons. 50% of the time, they get the wrong person, and often the wrong person is actually murdered. And yet these night raids are the tactics of choice along with drone attacks, assassinations, and death squads in a war that many Americans have actually forgotten is still going on as we move now into the 10th year of that war. So I think about courtyards and night raids and how our imagination, if it could just be awakened further, might help to shed light on a war that I believe most U.S. people, and the polls back it up, do not want to see continue. 56 to 70% of people polled in the United States have said that they don't see a point to this war. And we're told, anytime the president is asked about a reason as to why we remain at war in Afghanistan, we're told it's to dismantle and eradicate al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. That's the official reason. Now, Leon Panetta has been transferred from being the head of the CIA to taking General Petraeus' role over being the head of NATO. In December of 2010, Leon Panetta was asked, how many al-Qaeda operatives do you think there are in Afghanistan? And he answered, 57. 57? Coming in here, I saw a very athletic, strong-looking group of youngsters playing soccer or football or something out on the field. I mean, you could probably take a strong, athletic group of youngsters and put them over in Afghanistan, give them $1 trillion, and I'll bet they might be able to track down 57 al-Qaeda operatives over the course of 10 years. It just simply defies any kind of reason. Why are we staying there? And yet, when we talk to the Afghan youth peace volunteers, we don't hear from them desire for retaliation. We haven't heard revenge. In fact, I've heard the sweetest of questions. Moma John, he's actually 21 years old, asked me, what can we do to make your people like us better? What can we do to make your people like us better? As though we had some reason to dislike them at all. So consider this night raid. In an area called Bardak, there were 3 brothers whose family were so proud of them because they'd made it into the university. They were studying in Kabul. And of course, for poor families, that's the way to break through, to get an education. And so Ismail Nesmit and his brother Farabullah and another brother, Wahidullah, had come home from their studies to celebrate the beginning of Ramadan with their family. And that meant a big, huge meal. But they had to go right to their studies because they had exams that week. And so they excused themselves from the family, and they went into a guest room that the family compound had, and they went right to their books, and then they fell asleep studying, apparently. Their younger brother, a 13-year-old, Esmatullah, had come in and joined them. Well, that night, in the middle of the night, U.S. soldiers came bursting in. And it turns out that 2 days previously, somebody who had identified himself as Taliban had come to that family's home and had said, give me something to eat. Now, in the code in that part of the world, when someone knocks at your door and says, I need something to eat, the code is you feed the person. It stretches way, way, way back into a time when, you couldn't say to somebody, well, Motel 6 is that way or 7-Eleven is that way. If you didn't give the stranger something to eat or something to drink, they could die in the process of trying to walk across a long stretch of wilderness. Well, besides that, this is a Taliban warrior, and if you don't give that person something to eat, it could be that the Taliban warriors fellow Taliban will come the next night and kill your family. So yes, they offered the man something to eat, and that person was long gone. The United States troops perhaps had been following that person as a high-value target. This is how the drone surveillance works. They catch somebody on the screen, and then the people working the drones, maybe in a dimly lit trailer in Nevada, at Creech Air Force Base, or maybe at Hancock Field in Syracuse, upstate New York, follows a high-value target wherever they go. And then the kill chain has to be involved to decide, was that person going to a place where there might be other high-value targets? Maybe that place would be a place where the other people should also be killed. There's no way for anybody to prove themselves innocent or guilty. It's a lot of conjecture that seems to happen. But at any rate, the United States troops surrounded that particular house. And according to a younger brother who survived, they came right into the room where the 3 students were asleep, and they killed them one by one. And then the United States troops said no. First, the older one came running out with a gun, and we killed him before he would kill us. And then the second one came out and tried to pick up the gun. And then the third one also, and that's why we killed all three of them after they had run out to shoot us first. Well, the family had taken pictures, and it showed 3 distinct pools of blood on the floor in the room where the young men had been sleeping. And so eventually the United States, if you follow the story, and it doesn't come out on the first day when you see it mentioned in the New York Times that 3 insurgents were killed in Wardak, but if you stay with the story, you find out that eventually the United States troops said there was no evidence of any one of those people that were killed having been part of the Taliban. And so the best friend of Ismail Nesmith said, we don't have any reason to hate the foreigners who come to our country, but it is these mistakes that you are making that will cause your defeat. It is these mistakes that you are making that will cause your defeat. Well, I sometimes feel like the Grim Reaper's secretary at our office, which is just, the second floor of a 2-flat in Chicago. Voices for Creative Nonviolence made a commitment after we found ourselves kind of reading in the New York Times in the morning that X number of insurgents were killed, and then turning the page because it really wasn't news. We'd read something very similar the previous day. We made a commitment that we would maintain an Afghan atrocities update on our website, and that we really would research and try to find out all the circumstances, sort of shed light on each time when the accusation appeared that unarmed civilians had been killed by either United States or NATO forces. Well, it's been about once a week, sometimes twice, that we've recorded these kinds of instances. So I would like to share with you a pretty grim chronology. And it worries me. I don't want to be the one pointing my finger at someone else. I think that we all have to look in the mirror and see where our responsibility lies. But the someone else on my mind is General Petraeus. On January 19th, he was exultant because he'd seen a report that he felt was positive in terms of the United States gaining an upper hand. Now, I think we should see that in the context of knowing that General Petraeus is credited with having written the state-of-the-art manual on counterinsurgency. And that manual stresses that in order for a counterinsurgency campaign to be successful, and I'm a pacifist, even just getting that part of the sentence out is a bit difficult for me, but in order for such a campaign to be successful, you have to have 25 boots on the ground, 25 soldiers per 1,000 people in the population. So when you do the math for Afghanistan, there would have to be 600,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan to wage a successful counterinsurgency campaign. Well, I don't want 600,000 troops from the United States to be over there, but there's no way the United States is ever going to approach that higher number. The counterinsurgency theory also stipulates that until such time as you arrive at that tipping point when you have the 600,000, it is to be predicted that the violence will spiral up and up and up. So they know they can predict the violence to which U.S. soldiers will be subjected and to which Afghan civilians will be subjected. They can count on it to happen, only there's never going to be that tipping point. So why do we continue with the warfare? I can't imagine what it was that made General Petraeus feel that day of exultant excitement, but his words were, "We've got our teeth in their jugular and we're not going to let go now." Our teeth in their jugular and we're not going to let go now. Imagine if you're in Afghanistan and you're in the crosshairs of the world's largest arsenal aimed at you and your children and your family and your village, and maybe that gets translated for you. A month later, President Hamid Karzai called General Petraeus to his office, and he was in a fury. He said the killing of civilians must stop. 66 civilians were killed in an aerial bombardment, and General Petraeus interrupted him and said, no, no, no. My investigators have said that only 7 were civilians, and all the others were insurgents. Well, this was a competition between different sets of investigators, but Karzai's people had photographs, and they showed General Petraeus and his aides photographs of children whose bodies were wounded and burned as a result of the attack, and some of them were still in the hospital. And General Petraeus immediately responded by saying, well, that's how Afghan parents sometimes discipline their children. They burn them, they boil them, and exactly the reaction that we had here, many times multiplied, was the reaction of the people working in President Karzai's presidential palace. March 1st, 2 weeks later, the poorest of families in Afghanistan today, when they need fuel, as they do, because in spite of the United States having been their occupiers for 10 years, even in the areas where there's not battles raging, people don't yet have electricity. So what do? Well, in the worst of the places, in the refugee camps, you burn your own garbage. But in a village like the one that we know youngsters from in Bamyan, children, like a particular hero of mine, Zekrullah, will get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, get on the donkey, put a big basket on either side of the donkey, ride 6 miles till they find a stretch of mountainside where they can collect twigs and scrub brush, fill up their baskets, ride along the icy road if it's winter weather, or come back at the other seasons to their family home, put the fuel on top of the mud hut, and they've done their service, they've begun their day of service to their family. So it's the poorest families who ask their children to do that now, because people know it's very, very dangerous to be out on the mountainsides. What if you're mistaken for an insurgent? And so it happened that 9 children were on a mountainside. They had just finished scavenging the mountainside to get what scraps of wood they could find, and they'd loaded up their donkeys and they were ready to go. And all of a sudden, 2 huge helicopter gunships. These helicopters have engines that are the same engine that's used inside an Abrams tank. Can you imagine how menacing and fearsome a helicopter gunship like this would be for peasant children on a mountainside? All of a sudden, the big, huge machine hovered over the children. There was a green flash. Another helicopter appeared. One of the helicopters went up very, very high, came back down and shot down each of the children, killed them in cold blood. And the reason we know about this is because when the first helicopter gunship started shooting, a tree cracked in half, and the branches fell down and covered the youngest of the children. And he survived, and that was the story he told. And immediately, General Petraeus issued an apology. He said, this tragic event should never have happened. And he was right. But on August 27th, just several months earlier, the same thing in the same province, almost the same mountainside, had happened, and 6 children had been gunned down. Think of the My Lai massacre, and they were trying to collect scrap metal out on the mountainside. And then on March 27th, just several weeks later, more children were killed, and they were trying to clear an irrigation ditch. The drones can come up with extraordinary surveillance. They sometimes can be sending so many messages at once that in February of this past year, one of the drone operators realized that amidst all the information that was coming from the drones, he could get word that these were women and children on a bus convoy. But so much information was coming in at once that the kill chain couldn't sort it out fast enough. They would have had to have another machine to sort it out for them. And so even though women had jumped out of the first car in the convoy when it was hit and waved their scarves and said, "Civilians, civilians," they were gunned down. And in a second car, when women tried to stop the brutal assault, they were killed also. And it turned out that in fact the drones had that time given the proper information. But you see, now as we're moving more and more into robotized warfare, it could actually become the case that the very strongest of the generals won't be able to be in charge. With the drone proliferation, we may be moving into a time of warfare where decisions are actually being made by robotized machines. It sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? And yet it's becoming more and more of an ethical question for us to slow down and look squarely at and sort through, and then try to understand why people in Pakistan, which is an ally of the United States, have an approval rate of the United States which hovers around 4%. People are so angry and talk about people in the United States as being cowards because of the usage of these drone robots to shoot them down and sometimes their children. I was in Binghamton, New York, 2 weeks ago, and it was just ravaged by the floods. People didn't have any water left. They couldn't hose down their belongings. The belongings were covered with toxic mud and sludge. And yes, it was bad luck of, an environmental disaster, but there's no relief forthcoming for people in Binghamton. And meanwhile, and then we can think of many places around the United States where there hasn't been enough to go around and we can't share our resources and people are really feeling the pinch of poverty in terrible ways. Meanwhile, in the Garmsir district of the Helmand province, there are 150,000 Afghan people living, and the British troops had tried for about 4 years to assure that the Taliban would never come into this little network of hamlets where 150,000 people lived. And so the U.S. Marines said, we'll go in there and we'll be able to pacify the area. We'll be able to assure that the Taliban don't come in. Well, after 3 years and an expenditure of $3 billion, the United States Marines succeeded. But if you were to divide that $3 billion between the 150,000 people living in the Garmsir district of the Helmand province, you could have probably bought a large house, a BMW, and a fine education for each person living there and their children. It simply doesn't equate, it doesn't make sense that our warfare in Afghanistan should continue. And yet, where are the questions being asked? Where are the political leaders who would raise those questions? And I think we can't really spend much more time scanning the horizon to see if those leaders will speak up. I think we are the leaders that we are looking for, and we're the ones who very much have an opportunity and have a responsibility to speak up. In the Charahi Kambar refugee camp, when I first went into this camp, the kids went running to go and get the village elders because foreigners had come into this big, huge, wretched and sprawling refugee camp. And when the kids came back with the elders, they were men half my age. And I was kind of puzzled, these are the elders. But you see, when the life expectancy is 44 years of age, that's not to be so surprising. And these were people who helped me understand a Pakistani journalist's words. He said, hunger and anger combined are like two live wires. You touch them together, there's an incandescent flash that can't always be controlled. And I think that's understandable to me when I think back on some of the terrible impoverishment and suffering and displacement people have experienced. But I think we could also be people who feel hunger and anger. And anger tempered by and infused by nonviolence. Nevertheless, an anger over what the war makers and the war profiteers have done in our name, and a hunger and thirst for justice, a hunger and thirst for peace. And I think that will call us out to the margins. It will call us to be, in a sense, a bit odd compared to our neighbors. And yet, the good news is that I think it also calls us into an alignment with the belief that the man Jesus and his disciples had celebrated and lived, that we are all part of one another. So I thank you for this opportunity tonight to just begin to share some thoughts about young people, the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers in particular, who had invited us to come over and to be with them. And the reason I'm wearing a blue scarf, and you'd see some other blue scarves around this room, is because one of the very brave things these kids did, and it resulted in considerable persecution for them, including theft and arson and interrogation, but something they did was walk together, Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, from different ethnic backgrounds, publicly, as young people in Kabul, asserting that they want to live without wars. And this was a very brave thing to do, along with the tree planting, and also they lit candles in memory of each of those young children who had been killed in Kunar. And I asked one of the young women, Shaharbono, why did you choose sky blue? Is there anything special about that? And she immediately said to me, oh yes, Kathy, because there is one blue sky above us, as though she were channeling Pete Seeger. One blue sky above us, and you may remember those words. And I don't want to at all coat things with something saccharine, because I know what we're speaking about is serious as a heartbeat. And yet there was a certain truth force, as Gandhi would have said, to what these youngsters were telling us. One blue sky above us, one ocean lapping at our shore, one earth so green and round, who could ask for more? And because I love you, I'll give it one more try to tell a rainbow earth it's too soon to die. Too soon for any of the youngsters from the United States being sent to lone themselves to possibly kill or be killed. Too soon for any of the youngsters in Afghanistan. 65% of the country's population are under 25. Too soon to die, and always too soon for us to allow that vision of the beloved community living together in peace to be murdered, to be assassinated, to be wrecked by people who are profiting from war. Thank you very much.
So any of you have questions for Kathy?
Hi, thanks. I'm Roger Ryberg from Northwest Neighbors for Peace, and I was just wondering, does the WikiLeaks, some of their information, especially the one about the helicopter murdering those photographers, give more credence to what's going on over there, and has that really helped try to get the word out then?
Well, I certainly think that the film went all around the world and awakened many people to the fact that the United States soldiers were in cold blood killing people who were not attacking them. And what looked to many as a camera might have been mistaken as a weapon, but then there was this kind of a jarring and a very disturbing language that the soldiers, our soldiers, were using as they got themselves ready and positioned to continue to kill people, including then there were children who were at risk, but at least their lives were saved. But
even the car that came up to try to rescue the ones that were hurt.
Right, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Roger, for reminding us of that. Thank you. You've got a...
You had mentioned where the drones were being controlled from. They're actually being controlled right now from Fargo, 200 miles away.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that Fargo was actually controlling. Yeah. Yeah, even in Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, they're also starting to train people to use the drones. And if they're being used over Pakistan, then it's almost certainly Langley Air Force Base and the CIA. But any of these ones that are being used in Afghanistan today, possibly in Yemen and in Somalia, are being operated by people within the United States National Guard and Air National Guard bases.
Kathy, I'm a big fan of Jim Douglas, and I know that you're very good friends with him, and we have a quote by him in the bulletin for Sunday's worship. By the way, for trying to get you to come back on Sunday, Kathy, you're looking at the preacher for the day this Sunday in our church. She'll be preaching in worship. No, I don't know if she is, but it doesn't matter at St. Luke, I can tell you that. But Kathy, President Obama has said, and on more than just this issue, to his base, I know I haven't been doing what I said I would do. I need for you to make me do it by a show. You had mentioned us becoming the leaders. My question for you, just your opinion is that do you think there is hope in a big enough movement to stand up to the industrial military complex, the unspeakable, in Jim Douglas's words? In other words, is that a legitimate hope if we had a Martin Luther King kind of million-person march and flooded the Capitol? Are we strong enough to somehow address that power?
It actually surprises me, Gwyn, that given the expression in the polls of how much resentment there is over the spending on the war in Afghanistan, it surprises me that we haven't been able to galvanize and organize exactly what you're envisioning within the United States so far. I guess what I would say is be ready. The most perhaps we're able to do right now is keep telling the truth about the wars that we're engaged in, and we don't know, we can't predict what could be coming around the corner. No one knew that there was going to be a Mikhail Gorbachev and that the wall was going to come down when it did. I'm not saying that everything's been rosy ever since, but you can't entirely predict what history has in store. And so I think ours is certainly a matter of readiness, but also I think all of us can and should sort of recalculate the level of risk involved if we continue to go along with these wars, as opposed to if we take some further risk and step outside of our comfort zones, perhaps, and try to oppose these wars. I don't think fear is ever a good motive for people to act, but we have to, I think, maybe better understand just how much antagonism there can be toward the United States on the part of other people in other parts of the world. You know, because they're all asking the question as well, why is the United States staying in Afghanistan? And I think, if you don't mind me just taking a quick look at these maps here, you know, anytime United States troops are being given meals or something to drink, you know, water, a beverage, anytime they're using fuel, anytime they're using ammunition, most of those supplies are being trucked in. And let's keep in mind that 93% of the world's opium comes from Afghanistan. And so there are people who have long known how to rule the roads as drug lords, as warlords, and every stretch of road is controlled by people who are milking the United States taxpayers, maybe we don't know it, but this is the truth, for as much as they can possibly get in order to give permission, if you will, for all of these 7,000 trucks that cross into Afghanistan every single day. First they go through Pakistan, some cross over at Quetta, some go up further into the Khyber Pass, and then they fan out. There are 200 forward operating bases in Afghanistan and 5 major bases. So these trucks are constantly going all over the country, and the statistics are just incredible. For a 64-mile stretch of highway, to be built. It costs $2.8 million per mile of construction, because if the United States didn't pay that out, there would be a tax on the workers that were trying to do the construction. The going rate is $1,500 per truck to go along just a short stretch of highway between Gardez and Khost inside of Afghanistan. And an NPR report said that it cost $22 billion just to supply the U.S. troops with air conditioning during the very hot weather. And this one is the Congressional Information Research Service. The amount of money that it costs to fill one tank of an airborne or a landborne vehicle, one tank to be filled with fuel, is between $400 and $800. Where is all this money going? It's not only going into the pockets of people who might be local area warlords, sometimes it's going into the pockets of the Taliban, the very people we're supposed to be fighting. And so you have to, at some point, start to ask, couldn't that money be better spent?
Kathy, do we have another question?
Sure, thank you.
Hi, my name's Erin Pratt. I'm this
Erin.
guy's daughter.
Oh, well.
I don't know how many people are familiar with Starhawk, who is a major nonviolent leader. And she wrote a book called The Fifth Sacred Thing. And it was looking into the future and at the intersection of war and climate change, and what we were left with. And I think something I see is that there seems that we haven't quite made the connection among people who care deeply about the earth and who care deeply about humans, that the environmental issue of climate change and the issue of war and human rights is the same. Mm-hmm. It's the same fight. It's the very same greed that's driving this senseless murder and waste, is the very same greed that's driving the destruction of our planet. And I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, what I'm told by some of my friends from California is that Starhawk is planning to make The Fifth Sacred Thing into a film. And I think that would be a good way to reach many more people. And she certainly does sketch out in that novel a sense of horror over the war against Mother Earth, over the ways in which the militarism has polluted the planet, and not only the consumption and the greed on the part of war profiteers, and there's plenty of guilt to go around, but also just the level of pollution that is created by the worst polluter of any corporation is the Pentagon and its various components. So perhaps out of that confluence of environmental activism and anti-war activism, we might see something new. Again, I don't think it's most of the people in the world who don't have voices that can speak as strongly as ours really can't afford our despair. They need us to use our voices. It's so much more safe, if you will, for us to speak up here than for someone to try to speak up, for instance, as we learned in Bahrain yesterday, where medical doctors had tried to speak up against a dictatorship which is supported by the United States, and they found themselves sentenced to 15 years in prison. Well, if I speak up and I challenge the governmental policies here, I'm not going to be risking a massacre of my family members or myself being tortured or some kind of frightening interrogation scene. But we don't just get free speech. We have to take it. We have to exercise it, or it's just nonsense to even talk about having it. And so that's part of what I think can also be another confluence, Aaron, that the young people who are now occupying Wall Street, many of whom have, I think, been very prophetic in the environmental movement, might combine with some of the people who have reached retirement age and perhaps have a little more time on their hands to become involved. Thank you.
There's an action beginning next week, October 6th, Freedom Plaza, Washington, D.C.
How many here are planning to be there? Well, good. We'll see one another, yeah. October 6th is an action that's been planned for, and we may see more of these springing up in different parts of the country. But the idea is to show up in a plaza very close to the White House and not leave. Now, I'll confess I have to be in Alpena, Michigan on October 7th, so I'm leaving. But I think there will be many who will want to stay, and we should keep our eyes on these very dynamic kinds of actions that are being called for. Another one that Kate and I will be certainly keeping an eye on, and we've been part of in the past, and I'm very grateful for all that Roger has done, is to remember the people who are being held in detainment, sometimes indefinite detention, wearing orange jumpsuits and black hoods. This is the Witness Against Torture campaign that I'm thinking of. And we're hoping to have 2,227 people dressed in orange jumpsuits and black hoods stretching out from the White House all the way to the Capitol building to say that it should not be considered in the interests of the United States ever to torture anyone. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
Is there anything that's coordinated or thought of in the sense that, you know, we've got the small group here that's conscious of these issues and are thinking towards peace, where, you know, there's a day, you know, through the nation where people of that consciousness come together with that consciousness, because I think when you see things change across history, it's because there's a consciousness that starts and it's small and then it grows and it grows and it grows. And it seems like you almost have to link people that are aware, you know, maybe throughout the country, on maybe one day where there's prayer and connection between all this conscious, you know, ness about what's going on in Afghanistan. I mean, is there anything like that, like a prayer link or a day that's devoted to everyone kind of focusing on this in a collective way? Big question.
I have another question. Is a day enough? Yeah. Yeah, I think what we're looking at is the time when we might say, you know, all those other things that seem to be such compelling and pressing priorities have to be subordinated to a number one priority in our lives. And that's what happened in Tahrir Square. People said, we can't go back to what was going on before because we've come this far, and the risks to ourselves will be so huge if we lose. It's vital that we keep this space, not only just in Tahrir Square in Cairo, but in other spots all throughout Egypt. And I think when we reach that point wherein people will not be able to even consider going backward, then I think people will get their priorities more reasonably, more rationally put in place. Sometimes I think the major religion in this country, quite honestly, is shopping. And that the major distractions that kind of keep us from looking at some of those questions that you've mentioned, you know, we need to be conscious about, are just always predictably going to be there. If, you know, you just get through one season of, you know, Christmas shopping, and then pretty soon you're looking at the football extravaganza, and then pretty soon you're going to be looking at a basketball extravaganza, and then you've got the Oscars, and then you've got it just never stops. And, you know, meanwhile, people are just so vulnerable to being very, very concerned about what Kate Middleton's wedding dress looked like. It's hard to kind of tune out the multiple distractions in terms of sports and entertainment that often take us away from becoming interested in and involved with some of these very pressing and real problems that Aaron had just mentioned to us in terms of what's happening to the planet as the train hurtles dangerously close to what some would think is an abyss and might go over. We're in these very serious times. And so it's kind of like all hands on deck for those who have the consciousness that you're thinking of, but it could cost us. I think we'd all feel terrific about ourselves the more that we realize that we could be part of the generations that are going to put an end to war.
Hey, Kathy, thanks so much for what you do. I'm Kevin Smith from Minnetonka. And as you talked about the abyss, the tipping point, and taking back our freedom of speech, my take is it's so maddening right now with the drones in particular and all the bases they're building. I have family that aren't even aware of Yemen and Somalia and all these places where they want to hit bad. And you talk about be aware, this enlightenment of what might happen. I think we are seeing that right now, especially in Wall Street, and now thank you for being there as well at DC. So all I wanted to say was this is the time. In my book, this is definitely the time tonight. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Kathy, I also want to thank you for your commitment. It's very inspiring, and your sacrifices and the efforts to pull attention to this are so important.
Okay, just a little closer.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Okay. My question to you, you've been working with the youth in Afghanistan. I work at the University of Minnesota. I have a 24-year-old son who has become very jaded. His generation here is, I know that they feel completely cynical about a lot of things, and as things get worse and worse, I'm really concerned. When I come to peace movement events, I see a lot of people my age and older, but I don't see any young people, and I've tried to engage my son, and I don't know how to do it. When you're working with youth in Afghanistan, do you see anything other than complete desperation and disenfranchisement that tips people to the point where they become engaged, they relate with people outside of their own world, and they connect with others? I mean, is the cultural perspective that you described in the youth there unique to that culture, or do you think it's something we can inspire in young people here?
Well, I have to say that I have met jaded and despairing young people at the Bamiyan University. In particular, there was a young man who said that he could not ever imagine staying with the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers because he was so filled with violent rage toward the United States. So in honesty, I should tell you that. But I felt so protective of these young teenagers as they're hearing, an engineering student that they had once looked up to as part of their group saying, you're barking up the wrong tree in the wrong forest. And so I was actually kind of angry at this engineering student, thinking, why do you want to take away the hope of these younger guys and make them feel as though they're naive and a bit humiliated? And I was so impressed because the next day, we checked in with them, how did you feel? And they expressed understanding. They said, we've heard this before, and we understand that he's telling the truth as he sees it, but we're not ready to give up at all. And they have a very sturdy commitment that is unaffected by television or internet or sports distractions, because they never see it because they live in such incredible poverty, for one thing. But I also find that they don't see a future for themselves in continued warfare, and this is very much part of their reality. We were fasting. Kate had to leave. I think she's going back up to St. Catherine's in St. Cloud. But we were fasting as part of this Witness Against Torture, and we heard that these young kids were fasting with us, which is a very unusual thing for Muslim youngsters to do in their society, to fast for 24 hours, because their fast is very defined. It's the Ramadan fast, and you fast until the sun goes down, and then you stop fasting. So they had departed from what was normal to them, and people in their village were asking them a lot of questions. What are you doing? Living in a tent together and fasting with these Westerners. And they said that they understood that we wanted to end torture and they wanted to do the same. So we're in the United States and we're sitting in our kind of comfortable spot and on a Skype phone call with these youngsters, and they're huddled by candlelight in the cold, talking into a cell phone. And at one point, one of our friends said, it's January 15th. It's Martin Luther King's birthday. This is Carmen Trotta from New York. And he said, we ought to ask these kids if they ever heard of Martin Luther King. So he started to try to tell them who Martin Luther King was, and we heard a commotion at the other end, and these kids were jostling to see which one of them would be the first to deliver their memorized quote from a speech by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I mean, if you asked me to give a memorized quote from either the Muslim Gandhi, Badshah Khan, or Mohandas Gandhi, I'd be... And so, sure, they're living in a situation where at the age of 2, when they were toddlers, most of them were displaced from their homes. They grew up in these wretched refugee camps. Some of them have seen their fathers and brothers killed right before their very eyes. They have plenty of reason to say, we don't want to see war anymore. We've had it. Thank you.
I think we can go a little bit longer with this. Dick?
My name is Dick Hayden, and I remember the success that we had in actually stopping the Vietnam War. But there was one major difference then, and that was the draft. My friends and I were of draft age, and we were talking about draft numbers and moving to Canada and all sorts of things, which some people did. And it was the pressure that we knew we might have to go and fight this war we didn't believe in, which I think was the motivation, the PowerPoint for bringing an end to that war. But I don't see that same PowerPoint acting today. Do you have any ideas what that might be?
Well, thank you for the way that you phrased that. I noticed that you're not calling for a draft of our young people. Because I sometimes think, okay, start with 40 and up if we're going to call for a draft. Well, I want to go back to Aaron and that consideration of our environment. And this, I worry, this may seem a little bit abstract, but if you don't mind looking at this map with me, sometimes it could be sort of irreverently referred to as Pipelineistan. You see the area up near Turkmenistan, and then up above that you'd find Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And then do you see that word that says sea over to the left? Well, that's the Caspian Sea. And in the Caspian Sea basin, there's a huge, enormous reserve of fossil fuels and natural gas. Now, it isn't that the United States wants to take our natural gas and fossil fuels from that part of the world. But if you don't mind me just going back a map, on the left-hand side, the right-hand side is an imaginary CIA analyst's map, but the left-hand side tells the real borders. See the border that China shares with Pakistan. Recall that Pakistan is the only country in the Muslim world that has the nuclear bomb. And then please note that Afghanistan borders all of those stans near the Caspian Sea basin, and well, it would be, I think, reasonable for China, with its burgeoning industrial needs, to want to take fossil fuels and natural gas from this neighboring area, right? But if the United States can control the pricing and the flow of those precious fuels so that it costs more for China to get their hands on those material resources than it does for us, then we stand a chance in our economic competition with China, and we could almost say we're in a Cold War with China. We stand a better chance of getting an economic advantage. And so some would say that maybe the reason that President Obama is ready to sign with President Hamid Karzai a strategic protection agreement which would keep U.S. troops in Afghanistan until 2024, so imagine the trillions at that point that would have been spent, is because they want to be able to get this pipeline built. It's called the Topi Pipeline. It goes from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan through Pakistan into India. And on November 19th in Lisbon, Spain, NATO countries met. The Asia Development Bank said, oh, okay, we'll sign on the dotted line, we'll bankroll that pipeline. The NATO countries were exultant, and I think at that point, in November of 2010, we were hearing that maybe the earliest the troops could be withdrawn would be 2014. Well, when do they expect the pipeline to be constructed? Oh gosh, it's 2014. But now we're hearing 2024. And so it could be that the purpose for the United States presence has everything to do with being able to consume resources at the rate that we're accustomed to. And it's an insane rate. And I'll claim, I mean, I feel a little bit better about this trip because I took the megabus to get up here. It cost me $5. But I fly all over the place, and my carbon footprint is very, very heavy. But we live at an insane rate of consumption of irreplaceable fossil fuels. And the Chinese population is almost chomping at the bit to do as we do. So it is, in the eyes of strategic planners for the United States, important to be able to have less of a price for what we consume than what the Chinese or the Russians might pay. I believe the sane action would be for us to say, we can change. We don't want to live at a rate of consumption that's so out of proportion to what the planet can sustain. Now, when will that very rational kind of adult decision-making spread all through our country? Not when we're all caught up with what does Kate Middleton's wedding dress look like. And so this is why I think it's so important that we hang on to information and clarity and try to share it and to meld it with our deepest beliefs. What do we most deeply believe in?
Well, thank you. Let's have one more then, and then.
How do you think this Arab Spring, a real sea change in the Arab world, is going to affect the war in Afghanistan and U.S. policies in that area and so forth?
The question is, how do I think the Arab Spring is going to affect, the sea change in the Arab world is going to affect U.S. policy in this part of the world? I am hopeful that the Arab Spring won't turn into a kind of withering Arab winter, because the United States will continue to give the upper hand by virtue of where it channels its support to the militarists. And so this is in itself a very crucial question right now. I'm also hopeful that the courage that was shown by people in Tunisia, in Bahrain, that's being shown today in Syria, that we certainly saw in Egypt, that courage will light sparks, and that, you know, when people saw what happened in Wisconsin here in the United States, we'll get a better sense for what's potential. But are we going to be up to the task? I suppose the most hopeful reflection that I sometimes grab onto is, did the abolitionists have any idea how close they were to that elusive goal of being able to stop the buying and selling of human beings at the marketplace? And maybe we're getting closer to a tipping point we can't actually see so easily, but maybe we're not the ones who are going to be the ones who can sort of turn that. It's like trying to turn a power machine without any kind of power. You need to turn it around. But maybe we're not going to be the ones who will do it. But nevertheless, as Archbishop Romero had called upon each person to do, we're called to do what we can in our lives. I mean, we're each of us one drop in the ocean. But we should be responsible for our one drop's worth of energy and commitment to try to build a better world.
Kathy, wait, before you applaud, I know that you have some resources back there. Would you like that you could sell? Would you like to say a word about what those are before we give you an ovation?
You know, I'm the one who sold more Girl Scout cookies than anybody else on the Southwest side, and then lost the order form. So my mother had to buy all these Girl Scout cookies. That was the end of my Girl Scout career. I was a hero, though, because everybody had mint chocolate chip cookies for the rest of our teenage years. But I'm very bad at selling things. I do want to say, though, that in Chicago we had a very beloved figure, Studs Terkel. You might know of him. And when I got out of prison after the last time I was locked up in federal, he was waiting for me with a red rose, and that was a very nice moment. And so he had volunteered to kind of co-narrate a film, which I've now been bringing around with me again, because it not only is about the experiences of voices going over to Iraq, and it shows the Marines coming in and us going down and bringing them water and having unusual conversations, but it also focuses a bit on Afghanistan. So that I'm supposed to sell for $10. Our friend David Smith Ferry has a really beautiful book of poetry. It's called With Children Like Your Own. I'm kind of proud that I found the title for it and wrote the foreword, but the title comes from a Jacques Brel song, All With Children Like Your Own, imagining all of the people affected by wars in World War I and II. And then there is a part of the transcript for a trial that we were in that we turned into a play. The judge was so impressed by the expert witness testimony in a trial about these drones being used that he said he needed 4 months before he could arrive at a decision of whether we were innocent or guilty. So after 4 months, he did find us guilty. But we thought that that was pretty good that he needed 4 months to think about it. So it has Bill Quigley and Ramsey Clark and Ann Wright being our expert witnesses, and that I'm supposed to sell for $5. So, I certainly hope you would not forego taking something if you don't have the $5 or the $10 or the $15. And then there's a sign-up sheet if you'd like to receive our newsletter in the future. We're sending a delegation on Saturday back over to Afghanistan. Steve was part of a larger delegation. Now we're sending people out in 3s and 4s. One group has just come back who did a very impressive water filtration project, and I'm eager to hear from them. And our delegation that returned in August spent a lot of time interacting with people in hospitals, at universities, and again with the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. So we certainly would look forward to remaining in touch with you in the future. Thank you.
Remember to come Sunday and hear Kathy preach. We'll also have special liturgy. One piece is actually from a Jim Douglas excerpt from a book that's to be, and we're going to honor Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, which is this Sunday, with that liturgy. And so come and be with us. There are refreshments over here in this room. We'd love to have you stay for that. Now let's thank Kathy for her evening.
Thank you very much.